With our Unreal Engine project and applying some lights and some light effects and tweaks to the overall quality, we've really brought our scene to life here. Now what we want to do is take a look at some other light effects that we can play with to add a little more of an effect or an element to the scene here. So previously we added a post-process volume. I want to go inside that post-process volume and take a look at a couple of things that we can change or adjust to apply to our scene. One of the things that I want to take a look at here is auto exposure. So before we start to click around with any of this, I want to talk about what auto exposure is. By default, it's on all the time in Unreal Engine. And what that is, if we go back into our scene, I'm just going to hit escape so we're not selecting anything. We'll go to F11. And if I use the little bookmarks that I've set for you using the hotkeys 1, 2, 3, and 4, we can see some subtle light changes if we switch between something brighter, like maybe this scene here in 4, we can see a slight down in the light there. So this is an auto exposure or an auto adjustment of lighting there. Auto exposure in this case is also referred to as eye adaptation. And where you really see this effect happen here, if I just click this and hit F, so we're focusing on this guy, if we come into these dark kind of areas here, you're going to see the light kind of adjust a little bit depending on how dark we get into. So if we look into something over here and if we look towards that light, we're going to see the light adjust subtly inside the viewport. And that is called eye adaptation or auto exposure. Now, that's fine, but sometimes there are some cases where you may not want to use that. So how can we avoid that? Well, there are two ways. By default, underneath the Show menu, Unreal Engine has it active. You can go to Post-Processing and turn it off by clicking Eye Adaptation, and you can see that it affects the lighting. So if we just get out of there right now, hit Escape, everywhere that I switch to, the lighting is uniform. Nothing changes here. You're not getting that eye adaptation effect anymore. So this is important, especially if you're building something like a visualization. It does have its key advantages, though. It's nice and soft and subtle on the eyes. If you go from something like a bright window over to a dark area, it does do a nice adjustment for you in there. Let's turn it back on, because we're going to look at another method to actually further control it in here. So we'll go back to something like this view, number 1, and I'm going to hit F11 to get out of there. And I just want to go back down to the bottom and click on my post-process volume here. And here's our auto exposure. So if we go in and we take a look at auto exposure and we turn on min and max, I just want to point this out really quickly, that if you adjust these values to be exactly the same, say for example the minimum you want the brightness to be is 0.5 and the maximum you want that brightness to be is 0.5, you've locked it at that level. So that's exactly what we've just achieved here. And if we start to switch around, that lighting right now is locked to that exposure. So we're going to keep that exposure throughout. Nothing's going to change at all. Through that, we're not going to get that effect of eye adaptation or auto exposure happening. So you can see there are some advantages to that, and it all depends on what type of scenario you're trying to build in there. So I'm going to go back to my post-process volume and actually turn those back off and just keep the auto exposure on. I'll reset it to default by clicking that yellow icon in there. Now, the last thing I want to do here in the post-process volume is something kind of interesting for this scene. We're going to go to the lens flares. And that's what this post-process volume will do. And the lens flare effect is totally dependent on your lighting within your scene. So I'm going to start to click that on. I'm going to turn on intensity, and you'll see in the scene now we have a little lens flare that's popped into the scene. So let's take a look at how that works here. Whoops, I'm just going to click on something to focus. Let's use this bench. And I'm now using that as my center of focus, so I'll just hit escape so I'm deselected. And what we can do now is see that lens flare effect as I turn the camera around. And just in case of the recording, if it's not coming out that well, let's crank up the values on that. So we can crank up the intensity, make this a very intense lens flare. What we can also do is we can apply a little bit of tint to it. So if we wanted to make something maybe like a bit of a purple, we can do that. And you can see that we're getting that effect in there. We can also change the overall size of the effect. So if we wanted it really small and really subtle, or if we wanted it to be something a little bigger, we can do that as well. And just to point out, lastly, I don't have any here, but you can certainly build your own textures where you can bring in your own shapes to adjust the overall effect that the lens flare is going to have for the shape of that. So there's a quick way to get some interesting things like lens flares in your scene, as well as how we can work with eye adaptation using a post-process volume to adjust that eye adaptation or auto exposure within your scene. So there we've got something looking pretty cool overall in our hotel room scene now. And we can now start to either bake out the lighting at as high resolution as we'd like, or even start to render out some still images from this.